So, episode 4, and we made it all the way through my wardrobe in lockdown, which shows you how long this has been going on. What do we want to talk about today? Well, we'll talk about two things. Firstly, I want to talk about democracy and the principles behind democracy and how we build the mechanism of democracy to function. And secondly, I want to talk about, let's say, civil disobedience is a polite way to put it, and how that features into democracy and when not it should or shouldn't be used. If you watched the video so far, you've kind of got a pretty good understanding of, well, I hope, you've got a reasonable understanding of some of the key things like nations and neoliberalism and society today, so we can start to explain how we go about changing that society should we wish to. Now, democracy, we have largely agreed in the Western world, is the better way of having a government. It beats autocracy, a government of one, by a country mile. And we can all think of numerous examples that have been drilled into us of autocratic regimes not being the answer. But how did democracy come about, and where do we start when talking about it? Because we accept it as a given in our world that democracy good, autocracy bad, and while this is true, why is democracy good? What's the principle behind its goodness? Why is it considered the right answer according to the majority of thinking in the world? Well, democracy, we're not quite sure where its earliest example was, but we know that the ancient world had examples of it. So, Greece, Rome, both were kind of democracies at various points. And we have attributed, the birth of democracy to pretty much most people agree Athens in Greece. Whether or not that's true and how many sort of indigenous democracies existed long before that we just don't have recorded history of is a completely different matter. But for our purposes, let's talk about Greece. Democracy can be split into two categories, representative and direct. Representative democracy is where, we elect a board of officials who will run the country on behalf of the people. Direct democracy is I attend Parliament. Now, often that's not everybody attending Parliament. There have been examples of lotteries to elect officials of, everybody draws a chit in the post and it's like, oh, you're well done, you're in government for a year. Congratulations, put down your plough and get to work. But direct democracy has gone definitely out of fashion, let's say, and we almost exclusively live in representative democracies. In the UK, we have members of Parliament. In the US, they have senators. The point is, we have officials that we elect to Parliament or government, who then make decisions on laws on behalf of the people who voted for them. So logically, if I elect an official with whom I agree on a broad range of topics, they will push through laws or oppose laws in a similar way to how I would if I was in Parliament. This whole endeavour is designed to give the power of governance to the people who are being governed. But how many decisions come out of your government that you don't agree with? How often is a decision announced from, the steps of Number 10 or Capitol Hill that you don't agree with, that you feel isn't representing you? How many times on an election night have you stayed up, if you're a big political weirdo, and got really upset because the other team won? We give that power to the people who are going to be governed to govern themselves in theory. But if our government is producing things that we don't agree with, then surely that's a failing of the democratic system. If your views aren't being represented in Parliament by those people that you've elected, that's a failing. So how do we hold that to account? Well, in a functioning democracy, you would have journalism. You would have, newspapers and TV channels and, news broadcasts to your phone that would say, the government defies its voter base and pushes through 10 years of cuts. Recently, has the media done that very effectively? Well, again, that's probably one for the media bias episode, but I personally don't think so. And that means that there is less incentive for that government to be beholden to the people that it's meant to represent, which is a failing of the democratic system. Much like friends that you're very fond of, but can acknowledge have some negative aspects to their personality, we can like democracy. We can agree that it's the best solution, but understand that our democracy might not be the perfect version of democracy. Now, this is something that's not really taught to us. We are taught, well, our democracy has to be the right democracy because that's why we have it. Otherwise, we just make a better democracy, right? Well, yes and no. Does everybody get taught that? Because is everybody right in every school class in the world? And we all have plenty of examples of, autocratic regimes self-mythologizing how good they are at stuff. Kim Jong-un has caught a unicorn in the hills of North Korea. And that's out there stuff, but is that train of thought any different to us being told that our democracy is perfect and that to complain about it is a problem? When actually to complain about democracy and to challenge it to change is in itself a function of democracy. If you can't change anything about your system, you haven't got democracy. That is the democratic process. To summarise, to give power unto the people who are to be governed, and to facilitate and allow change where necessary. How can we change things if our democracy isn't representing us? Now, this is a question that comes up a lot, and it's very, very polarising. And one aim of this channel is not to be polarising. You know, we want to present information to people to genuinely challenge their thinking without scaring them off or convincing them that we are, you know, extremist lunatics or whatever. But in order to challenge that thinking, sometimes we have to ask uncomfortable questions. I mean, that's very... If you've watched the Nations and the Neoliberalism video, then you'll know that that's something that we're willing and able to do. But again, we must ask a bit of an uncomfortable set of questions here. How many of your rights and freedoms as a person were won solely through the legal democratic process? If you're a woman in the UK, you wouldn't be able to vote if it was only the legal democratic process that we acknowledge. The suffragettes movement was outside of the law for a very long time. The challenge to give women the vote, you know, that fight went on for decades and decades. That was not won within the structure of our democracy. That was won largely through civil disobedience. If we acknowledge that, you know, it was right, women should have the vote, obviously, and so we say that the suffragettes movement was the right thing to do, even if it wasn't democratic, how do we decide, without the gift of hindsight, where it is acceptable or not to act outside of the democratic system, outside of those laws that we've seemingly all voted on, in order to effect change? This comes back to neoliberalism, and one of the key lies of neoliberalism, one of the other ones, you know, we've been through a few already, one of the key lies of neoliberalism is that civil disobedience was necessary to attain the state we have now, but any further civil disobedience is unthinkable. And I wonder why anybody would want to look at it that way. Because, you know, we acknowledge that we don't live in a perfect society and there are rights and freedoms that people still don't have who should have them. So why can't we achieve those not just through voting in Parliament, as many rights and freedoms have won in the past? Well, again, it comes back to this argument of the status quo. It is much more beneficial and much easier for governments and societies to exist in a status quo than it is to change. People often prefer it. And so the idea of changing some of those things, it can be scary and intimidating. And governments don't like scary and intimidating because it tends to lose them votes. Let's say that you come across a campaign that you agree with, that's arguing for something that is morally right. It doesn't matter what the issue is, but just think of something that you believe in that we don't currently have in our system. Now, that could be equal rights or equal pay for, you know, marginalised individuals. That could be equal access to healthcare or education, a whole host of things. But just fix in your mind that principle. Now think how you would go about changing our society to reflect that goal inside the democratic process. Well, you've got to find a party that agrees with that principle, which, if there's none on the table, sorry, good luck next year. Or you might have a minor party who you could vote for, which, good luck in a few years. You've then got to find a representative in your election, because not everybody is represented everywhere. You've then got to vote for that person, along with a load of other people who also have to vote for that person for them to attain government, and then they have to hold up on that principle that they've said in their manifesto, which, as we've said, if the media isn't functioning like it should, they've got less motivation to do that. That's a lot of steps. And you'll say, well, what about like petitions, right? You know, we have a system in the UK where if a petition, an official petition on the government website reaches more than 100,000 signatures, it is debated in the House of Commons. Makes perfect sense. No laws against nobody attending that debate, though. Or no representatives from the government, at least. Or sending a skeleton crew, as it were. You'll find a petition to, you know, not extradite this person, or to, you know, get the government to intervene on behalf of a British national abroad, that reach millions of signatures, and the debates are 5 minutes and recognised by the speaker and then shoved under the rug, as it were. So there's a workaround, even in the system. Now let's consider how you change it outside of the democratic system. Well, okay, you get you and a bunch of your friends who also agree with you, and you do a march, let's say a protest march. Okay, well, that you might need a few thousand people, but you probably already had a few thousand people who agreed with you because they were going to vote for that person. And those people need to arrange to meet up at a specific time and place and location and march. Now, in a functioning democracy, the media would pick up on this and say, you know, outcry as X issue is ignored. If the media aren't doing that, what's the benefit to marching? Probably isn't one. We saw millions of people march in the UK to oppose Brexit. We're still leaving the EU. Now, arguably, through direct democracy, we voted to leave the European Union, and that's fine. But a lot of people weren't happy with that decision. They weren't represented by that decision. And they wanted to be heard. And that's not me taking sides on that particular debate, that's just a fact. If we are taught that civil disobedience is net wrong, that any peaceful demonstrations like petitions or protest marches will be ignored, and that through your democratic system you can't really change that thing to the way you want it to be, what option's left to you? Well, you could stage a revolution, which historically hasn't had the highest chance of success for changing societies for the better. Often it just ends up in people passing power between themselves. But could you cause a large enough inconvenience to an economy and to a government that they had to change what you wanted? And what bargaining chip do you have? Well, you've got your time, if nothing else. Everybody's got their time. And if the coronavirus pandemic has taught us one thing, it is that most wealth in economies is created by the labour of ordinary people and not by the wealth of billionaire investors. Look at the US stock market. Oil is currently at a negative price because everyone's at home, nobody's travelling, and there's no demand for it. So can we, through just collective action alone, change policy? Well, once upon a time we could. At least in the UK, strike action and collectivist workforce action was a huge part of UK political spheres. A condition was added to almost every bill that went through Parliament of what will the unions think about this? Now, those unions arguably attained a lot of power and did some things that weren't great, but what that principle is, when it says, what do the unions think about this, is what are workers going to think about this? And when we say worker, we don't just mean like factory worker or farm worker or something. That's anybody who makes money through their labour, not by owning stuff. We'll talk about the distinction between like rentier economies and stuff in another video at some point. But if you make money through your labour, so if you're going to work to earn a wage and you're not on sort of like a bonus scheme through dividends or shareholding or investment, then you're a worker. And you can be a worker and also have some money in stocks. That's a thing that's also true in the modern world. So what would the workers think about this? What would the people think about this? Is a pretty good caveat to have on every bill that passes through Parliament. So why don't we have that anymore? Well, in this country, Thatcher and the establishment of neoliberalism broke the unions, and they've never had any power since. And she is arguably the most divisive British politician in recent history. So what if we wanted to change something now, without those powerful unions, without the ability to go to the miners' union or the supermarket workers' union? Well, unions themselves were a creation of the state in order to funnel collectivist action into a manageable area. States established unions as you can strike to affect change, but you've got to do it in a way that your union votes for it. We then get notification so we can make an alternative arrangement, and then you can strike, which fundamentally changes how effective that is as a piece of action because people have got time to prepare for it. If you arrive on Monday morning and just nobody's going to work, then you immediately panic and you're like, well, why aren't these people going to work? And they'll all stood outside saying, well, actually we want to be paid more. And you go, well, okay, we've got to pay you more then. If you tell people, in 2 weeks we're going to strike because we're worried about pay, you'll go, okay, cool, no problems. And you'll plan in your diary for in 2 weeks' time to ensure you have some other workers come in or to buy a robot between now and then. Which is one of the problems of collective action in a neoliberalist society. It has to be approved and stamped by the state. That limits its effectiveness. So when is it fair or right to take that action? To what extreme does a society or a people have to be pushed before it is morally the justifiable thing to do to say, no, I'm sorry, I know you're the government, and I know that the majority of people voted for you, technically, but I'm not going to listen. I want this change, and I will not accept no for an answer. I can't answer that question for you. That is a personal decision. When has the too far point been reached? But we have to consider that in an economy that has completely shut down these last few weeks because people couldn't attend work, people have more power than maybe they've realised for a long while to affect change if they care about it enough. Well, that's it, and I hope that video has given you some things to think about. Like I say, we are trying desperately to keep personal biases out of this as much as possible and just to encourage thought and provoke some considerations in everybody who watches this. And I'm hoping we're achieving that thus far, but the next video is probably going to be pretty divisive, and I can only apologise for that. It is something that we need to talk about, though. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. The weather's still lovely, and wherever you are in the world, stay safe. Thanks.